Good evening. Very nice to have this fine crowd here. A fascinating program here this evening in the forum. Bilingual education. Is it in our children's best interest? Now, that's a serious issue, and I'm a rather interesting fellow. I take my work seriously, but not myself, but really not much of levity to say. We've had a wonderful discussion in the dinner where our good moderator was the presenter. That was interesting stuff. And Christopher Edley shared a great deal of the President's new proposal. So, welcome to you in the Institute of Politics. It's a great honor to be the director. The purpose of the entire Institute is to try to inspire people to public life. And there are many of you here who I hope are finding that to be so. It is difficult of presentation, but it is a very wonderful part of life, public service. And so we have here tonight those who will present this fascinating topic. And so let me introduce first Dan Schnurr. Dan is currently a fellow at the Institute of Politics. His study group, which is held Tuesdays at 4 o'clock, is titled California, Where Tomorrow's Politics Happen Today. He is the former Director of Communications for Governor Pete Wilson and former Communications Director for the California Republican Party. He has served as a political analyst and commentator for many California radio stations and newspapers, and is certainly giving us a great opportunity to hear him and to work with the students. Dan, there you are.
I have learned after a month here now that if I refer to my introducer as Senator Simpson, he will get mad at me in the morning. So Al, thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate it. I also appreciate the plug for my study group, and for those of you that weren't taking notes, that's Tuesdays, 4 to 5:30 in the Institute of Politics. And specifically for those of you who are interested in tonight's topic, I'd urge you to attend the study group we're holding not Tuesday, but the following Tuesday on the 17th of this month, in which we'll bring in members of the California State Legislature to talk about the emerging Hispanic American majority in California and how it affects our states and our nation's politics. The reason I've been asked to speak here, I think, and to some extent the reason that this debate is taking place here tonight at all, is because of a ballot initiative that the people of California will vote on this spring, this June, that would dramatically change the way that non-English speaking students are taught in the schools of our state. Unlike at least some of our panelists tonight, I did not have the good fortune to be born in California, but rather several years ago had the good sense to move there. And we Californians are inordinately proud of the various exports that we have sent to all of you in the East. Not just vegetables and fruits and semiconductors, not just skateboards and hula hoops, but political exports as well. We've exported Jerry Brown and Ronald Reagan, something to like and dislike on both sides of the political aisle, tax cuts and term limits, environmentalism, and healthcare reform. And now it appears that we are on the verge of exporting our most recent public policy debate, that debate on the fate of bilingual education in our state. One of the themes that I've tried to get across during my time here at the Kennedy School is the profound effect that our state has had on the rest of the nation, economically, culturally, politically, and demographically. Wallace Stegner said that California is America, only more so. And although he was not talking specifically about California's rich cultural and demographic mix, he may well have been. Because over the past few decades, while the percentage of whites in our state has gradually declined as a percentage of the population, while the number of African Americans has held relatively constant, the number of Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans in California has increased dramatically to the point where by the year 2000, whites will actually make up less than 50% of California's population. Hispanics, meanwhile, Hispanic Americans now constitute roughly 1/3 of the state's population, and Asian Americans are about 18%. Both numbers are expected to increase rapidly in the years ahead. Now, these same cultural and demographic shifts are beginning to be seen across the United States, and I suspect will be seen even more quickly in the near future. Which means that public policy debates that we have engaged in California on issues like illegal immigration, on racial and gender preferences, and now on bilingual education are coming your way as well. Now, although tonight's discussion on bilingual education is going to take place primarily at least, at the level of public policy, the debate over the English for the Children initiative, or Proposition 226, will take place to a large degree in the context of electoral politics. So the organizers of tonight's forum thought it would be useful before the debate gets underway for me to try and provide you with some sense of the political landscape on which this battle will be fought. So I'm going to spend just a minute or two, therefore, attempting to do just that, to provide some context and some recent political history that led our state to this point, and to give you an idea of some of the political baggage that Californians will be carrying with them as they make their decision on how they're going to vote on this question later this spring. Historically, and I'm speaking of recent political history, there are two important things to keep in mind as we enter into this debate. First, Californians have just completed, or I should say are in the process of completing, two very public, very bitter, and very divisive fights on the issues of illegal immigration on the 1994 general election ballot and racial and gender preferences in 1996. So sensitivities in our state are very high for an issue that has the potential to be just as volatile. And to this point, both sides of the fight over this ballot proposition have avoided this kind of rhetoric. And it's to the credit of both Mr. Uns and Mr. Honda and to their respective supporters that this debate so far in our state has remained on the level of public policy without degenerating to a lower level. Second, the issue of bilingual education is not a new one in California. Bills have been introduced in the California state legislature now for 10 consecutive years in a variety of ways that would reform our process of bilingual education. And each of those bills has died every year in a legislative committee without the benefit of coming to the full legislature for a vote. So there are those in our state and elsewhere who would argue that ballot initiatives are a clumsy way of making public policy, that they're a sledgehammer as opposed to a scalpel that legislative policy development can achieve. And for the most part, I think most people would agree with them. But not just on this issue of bilingual education, but on all public policy matters, the people of California have historically turned to our initiative process as an outlet for their frustrations when they don't see their elected officials dealing, in their opinion, forthrightly with an issue that is important to them. And bilingual education is the most recent example, I think, of that dynamic. One last point I'll make before turning the program back to the people who you've come here to hear. And I'd like to talk very briefly about what the public opinion polls in California are showing right now as it relates to this issue. Most statewide polls taken by the mainstream media show that this ballot initiative has between 2/3 and 80% support of all Californians. And each of these polls has showed, interestingly enough, even larger numbers of support among Hispanic American voters. But like all polls, as all of you know, a lot of this depends on how the question is asked. When La Opinión, the Spanish language newspaper based in Los Angeles, posed a question to Hispanic American residents of California on this issue, they asked them very specifically, do you favor an end to bilingual education? And to that question, the levels of support dropped fairly dramatically, which suggests a potential window of opportunity for the proposition's opponents. So we're about 3 months away from deciding this issue in California. The advertising wars haven't started yet. The name calling that too often characterizes these kind of campaigns has not yet been seen and hopefully will not be seen. But tonight we'll have the opportunity to hear leading spokespersons on both sides of this issue make their case to you. And when you pick up the newspaper in early June and you see what those crazy Californians are sending you to deal with this year, just remember you heard it here first. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan. You're a great addition to the fellow program. Now let me introduce Christopher Edley. He's been a professor of law at Harvard Law School since 1981. In 1995, he served as a special counsel to the president. He assisted in the White House review of affirmative action programs. He's the author of Not All Black and White: Affirmative Action, Race, and American Values. He is co-director of Harvard's Civil Rights Project, very steady, thoughtful, patient man, and a longtime good friend of the Institute of Politics and the moderator of the evening's forum. Christopher?
Thanks very much. It is an honor to have been asked by the students to moderate this panel, and I'm going to rule with an iron fist. I've already warned the panelists of that, so in advance let me warn the audience of that. As an academic matter, I'd ask you or encourage you to bear two things in mind. This issue is critically important because of the role of education as a gateway to opportunity. But it's also critically important because it's a window on the question of national identity and how it is formed and what we mean by community. There's a great deal at stake apart from the politics of various ethnic and racial factions in one state. This is really about America in the 21st century. Our first speaker, the way we're going to do this is that we're going to hear from our two political leaders and then from our two researchers, and we're going to alternate between opponents of current bilingual education and folks on the other side of the issue. I'll let you define how you would stake it out. But we'll begin with Ron Uns, the Honorable Ron Uns, who was the 1994 challenger to incumbent California Governor Pete Wilson. He's a theoretical physicist by training, president and CEO of Wall Street Analytics, Inc., a financial services software company he founded in 1987. And he's chairman and author of the English for the Children Initiative campaign in California. Mr. Uns.
Thank you very much. I guess what I thought I'd do is give you a brief background of how the initiative evolved, and then a little bit of coverage of the initiative, and then obviously as the debate evolves in Q&A, we can get into a lot more details of the sort of things you're most interested in. Now, I'm somebody who's always been very interested in public policy issues, as far back as I can remember, especially issues that deal with questions of race and ethnicity and social policy, which I think are very important in a multi-ethnic society like the United States. And in particular, I've always been very skeptical of bilingual education. I never really thought it made much sense. For example, my mother was born in Los Angeles, but she grew up not speaking any English at all. And then when she went to school, she very quickly learned English and actually ended up graduating college with high honors with a degree in English literature. So it never seemed to make sense to me as to why children would not be taught English as soon as they start school. Now, on the other hand, the origins of this particular initiative effort came in 1996 when I read a series of articles in Los Angeles Times describing how a group of immigrant Latino parents in downtown Los Angeles had to actually begin a public boycott of their local elementary school because it was refusing to teach the children English. And that seemed very strange to me. In other words, I'd always viewed bilingual education as being a failure, but there's a big difference between a program being a failure and when it's gone off the deep end and gone into insanity to the point where schools refuse to allow children to learn English. When I had some time and I was down in Los Angeles, I decided to investigate the issue a little bit more carefully. And I set up a meeting with some of the parents involved in that boycott, along with a local immigrant rights activist who was working with them, just to see whether the stories were true or whether they'd gotten distorted in the media. And it turns out everything really was true. The school was refusing to teach the children English, despite the parents' wishes. And the parents had to actually start carrying picket signs outside the school until finally the school backed down and agreed to teach the children English. Now, they also emphasized to me that some of the worst aspects of the bilingual education system are not really what people think of. In other words, there's a perception out there when children go through these programs, they leave the public school system not being able to speak English properly. And that really is false. In other words, we live in a society where movies and TV and the larger culture is so heavily English-oriented that even if English is not taught much in the public schools, the children certainly one way or the other will learn English. But the point that was made to me is that under the system of bilingual education, where children are not introduced to written English generally until as late as the 4th or 5th grade, which is very late to learn how to read and write, the end result is that many of these students leave the public schools not being able to read and write English, not being literate in English, even if they can speak it all right. And obviously, if you leave school not being able to read or write English properly, you really have very limited options in front of you, and that leads to a lot of other problems in our society. At that stage, I decided to do a little bit more investigation on the statistics on bilingual education in California, and the numbers were staggering to me. I'm somebody who's been interested in this issue, but I was completely unaware of how bad they were, and virtually everybody else I've discussed the issue with during our campaign had also been completely unaware of how bad the numbers looked. Today in the state of California, and these are the official government statistics from the Office of Bilingual Instruction, today in the state of California, 1/4 of all the children in public schools don't know English. And of the ones who don't know English, only 5 or 6% successfully learn English each year. That is not a misprint, 5 or 6% per year. 95% of the students who start a given school year in California not knowing English are still classified as not knowing English at the end of that same school year. And that is insane when you're talking about young children who can learn another language very quickly and easily. I also found out that the current law governing bilingual education in California had actually expired 11 years ago. The law ended 11 years ago. But just as was mentioned, the state legislature and the politicians in Sacramento had been deadlocked for 11 straight years on whether to renew the law or modify it or do something about it. With the end result is that the policy was in complete state of paralysis and gridlock. Therefore, the only option of actually changing the system would be through the initiative process. And I began to consider putting an initiative on the ballot to get rid of bilingual education. Now, there's actually a lot of misconceptions about what we call bilingual education in the United States, in particular in California. Bilingual education has absolutely nothing to do with learning 2 languages. That's a very common identification of the term, but it really doesn't. What we call transitional bilingual education, which is 99% of these programs, are designed with only one goal, and that goal is to teach the English language to the children in school. It is not designed to help the children become literate in their original native language. It is simply designed to teach English. And it is designed to teach English by not teaching English, by teaching the children for several years only in their native language. The educational theory that it's based on, I'm extraordinarily skeptical about, and anyone who's really reviewed the research in detail sees that there's very little basis for it whatsoever. It is the idea that the best way for a child to learn English when they start school at the age of 5 is for them to be given several years of virtually only native language instruction with a relatively small amount of English, bringing them up to about the 3rd grade level in their native language, at which point they find it very easy to learn English, switch over to English, and never end up getting above the 3rd grade level in their own native language. The end result is that these children generally leave the public schools at about the 3rd grade level in their native language and in the English language, which means that, obviously going on to college is really just beyond them. That is really the core of what we're talking about in the system. Now, at the point I started thinking about doing an initiative, I really felt that since most of the people I'd been involved with or talked with over the years had been skeptics of bilingual education, it would probably be worth my meeting and talking with the leading activists and academics and organizations who support bilingual education to see whether I was missing something in the statistics and how the numbers could look so bad if the program really worked. So I met, for example, with the leadership of the National Council of La Raza in DC. Sometime later than that, I met with the leadership of MALDEF. I talked with some leading academics and professors and activists. Not one of them, not a single one, would defend the current system of bilingual education in California or in the United States. They all admitted it didn't work well. They all admitted it had terrible problems. They all said, oh, these children are being shortchanged. Their educational career is being ruined. The problem is, they said, not with the theory of bilingual education, the problem is the implementation. They all said the programs didn't have enough money or didn't have enough teachers or didn't have the right teachers or didn't have enough administrative support. And they all said, if we fix the problems with implementation, then the program will work ideally well the way it does in theory. Now, I'm somebody who comes from a scientific background. And the question I ask them is, if this program has been around in California for 25 or 30 years, and it's never been made to work in all that time, why do you think it'll ever start working in the future? And they actually had no real answer to that. They said, well, we think it'll be made to work once we get these other resources that we need. There is no evidence whatsoever that anywhere in the United States bilingual education has worked on a large scale since in the 30 years it's been introduced. Furthermore, it is used nowhere else in the world outside the United States. No other country uses it. Every other country uses the sort of intensive short-term English immersion program that our initiative advocates. What we would do, therefore, in our initiative is to take young children when they start school, if they don't know English, and by God, you teach them English. And since almost all of these children we're talking about are 5 or 6 years old, at an age when it's very easy and quick for them to learn another language like English, they would learn English very quickly, and then they'd be mainstreamed in with the other children, and that would end the issue of bilingual education, which has been around for an awfully long time, but it never really worked in that period. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Uns, and a great example in terms of keeping to the time limits. Next, we have the Honorable Mike Honda, who is Assemblyman from the 23rd Assembly District in California, Santa Clara County, member of the Education Committee and of the California-Mexico Affairs Committee. He served in the Peace Corps in El Salvador. He has a BS in biology, a BA in Spanish, an MA in education. As a former member of the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, the San Jose Unified School Board, the Planning Commission in San Jose, and also of the State Curriculum Commission, no stranger to questions of education policy. The Honorable Mike Honda.
Thank you very much. And
I'm sorry,
also,
and was I correctly informed that you're the first Asian American Democrat in the state legislature?
in about 16 years.
In 16 years.
We had some in the past. Thank you very much, and let me also extend my thanks and gratitude to those who had invited me to share this evening with you. I'm really overwhelmed with the invitation, but I'm underwhelmed with the subject, because I think that the subject is going to really become the wave of the future. We have to look at the public policy rather than look at some anecdotes and some of the emotional issues surrounding bilingual education. So let me start off, first of all, by saying that I do believe in bilingual education, and I do believe that bilingual education is suffering the same kinds of maladies that public education is: the lack of resources, the lack of qualified teachers, the lack of training. Having said that, let me explain to you what it is that I'm doing in the state of California as a legislator. When I saw the statistics and the poll that came out on Proposition 227, that the Proposition 227 did enjoy quite a bit of support from the Republicans. It was 80% those who were polled. Among the Democrats, it was 73%. Among the Latino families who were polled, they enjoyed something in the neighborhood of 84% support. When I looked at the poll further, there was another question in there, other than would you support English being taught to our left children? The other question was, how do you feel about local control? And those who were polled in the same poll, 55% of the folks said, we like the idea of local control. That became the genesis of this idea of putting forth Assembly Constitutional Amendment 7, which basically states as a policy that if any laws that's going to be passed either through initiatives, statutes, or through administrative regulations that would impose one singular methodology upon a school district, excluding every other methodology, that methodology would have to go under a very intense scrutiny by educational experts. And if the educational experts say that this methodology has so many good things about it that it should be imposed upon the state of California on all children in all school districts. The idea of imposing one methodology to the exclusion of every other methodology on a local school board upon teachers and upon children was something that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. So rather than saying we should defeat Proposition 227, the idea of giving another choice to the public, to put on the ballot another choice for the public to look at next to Proposition 227, because people have a choice, correct? I didn't want to impose upon them a way to kill something, but a way to consider another way of looking at public policy and public education. So having thought about that, having a constitutional amendment that would sit next to Proposition 227 gives people choices whether they want to have a methodology imposed upon them, or do they want local school boards to decide what methodologies are most appropriate for their own communities. The proposition, my constitutional amendment would also say to teachers, do you prefer to have one methodology imposed upon you and have all your preparation, all your work, and all your professional expertise be put aside and be told that thou shalt teach English to English learners in English and to the exclusion of every other methodology? What Proposition 227 does is disallows academic freedom. What ACA 7 does is allows that to happen. The other area of public policy is parental choice. Now, parental choice is something that's critical in making sure that youngsters enjoy the collaboration and the decision-making process that goes between teachers and parents. And if you take away parental choice, then you take away a basic ingredient of how a child will succeed in the classroom. What 227 does is tells parents that they do not have a choice. You have to put children into an English-only classroom based upon their proficiency in English. And when you do that, and the parent wants to have that child out of that classroom, they're told that you have to go through a waiver process. But the waiver process says in the initiative, if your child is proficient in English and the child's under the age of 10, then you can apply for the waiver. Now, why would any parent want to use a waiver process for a child that already speaks English, and why would that child already be in that classroom? There was a contradiction in there. But aside from the contradiction, the issue about parent choice, a parent has to go through so many loops and so many steps in order to even get considered having a child taken out. Under the ACA 7, it maintains status quo, where parents and teachers collaborate together, and where, quite frankly, the school district is required to communicate with the parents to tell the parent what exactly the education program is for the child. And that's a collaboration, and then the parent can make choices from that point. It's a proactive part on part of the district to work with the parent, not a proactive part of the parent to take a child out of a classroom. So ACA 7 offers a choice to the public and to the people of California whether they want to see one methodology imposed upon their children and all children who are limited English proficient. Thank you.
Two for two. Our next speaker is Rosalie Porter. She's Executive Director of the Institute for Research in English Acquisition and Development. She is a member of the Massachusetts Education Reform Review Commission and the Massachusetts State Advisory Council on Bilingual Education. She also formerly was the director of the English as a Second Language and bilingual programs in the Newton Public Schools for a full decade, 1980 to 1990. A rich range of experience. Ms. Porter.
Thank you. Let me tell you how I came to bilingual education. In the early 1970s, when I thought I would like to be a teacher of Spanish literature, there was a great new sensation, and it was called Bilingual Education. And there was a great demand for teachers who were bilingual, fluent in Spanish and fluent in English. And so I put aside my literature idea and became a bilingual teacher in the Puerto Rican community of Springfield, Massachusetts. I taught for 5 years. I then became director of a program. And since this experience, I have taken such a serious interest in this field that I have gotten deeply into the research, the theories, the practices. And in the past 7 or 8 years, through my work with the Reed Institute, I have been advising school districts across the country on the improvement of programs for language minority children. This is what I do full-time. The experiment, when it began, called Bilingual Education, and I believe the audience is fairly familiar with what bilingual education is. We don't have to explain it. The idea was very appealing, that through instruction in the native language, students would not lose any of the content learning. They would keep learning their subjects while learning the English language. And within a 3-year period, this transition would take place, and students would become very competent in English and able to do regular classroom work. My observation was it did not happen. It did not happen in 3 years. It did not happen in 5 years or 6 years. I became a critic of bilingual education, first through practical experience. Before I had a chance to read much of the research, I saw students that I had taught in kindergarten coming into my 5th grade class, and they had still not mastered enough English to be reading, nor were their academic skills in Spanish that good either. I realized that bilingual education alone is not the solution to all the problems of language minority children. Many language minority children are the children of families of poverty, families that move frequently from one city to another, families that have difficult situations. But if we in the educational establishment put other roadblocks in their way to achieving an equal education, then we are not helping the situation. Are there some good aspects to what bilingual education has done in the 30 years it's been around? Yes, indeed. Certainly, providing more funds for school programs, especially targeted for these students, is a healthy thing. Certainly, there has been a heightened awareness of cultural differences, of linguistic differences. Teachers are trained to help students in the second language learning situation. Parents in bilingual communities are more valued. We reach out to bilingual parents. We bring people from the community into our schools as volunteers, as assistant teachers, and as teachers, counselors, social workers. This is a very rich activity that has been going on now for a number of years. But has this educational effort achieved or come near to achieving its educational goals? And here, I must say, the results are very disappointing. I would have to say, as a whole, bilingual education has not proven itself. And we now have 30 years of research. In the early years, we took the bilingual education idea on faith. I did. We thought it sounded like a good idea. But now we have 30 years of research. And let me just read a couple of very brief quotes. In 1992, the state of California, with 20 years of experience with bilingual education, published a statewide study in which they reported the results of 20 years of bilingual education, poor quality of bilingual programs, no evidence that native language teaching is beneficial. Students kept in bilingual classes years beyond the point where they have learned English. In 1994, the state of Massachusetts, my state, which passed the first bilingual education law in the country, never collected data on student achievement, even though it was required in the law. Finally, in 1994, we have the first report, 23 years of bilingual education. And the commission and everyone on the commission was a supporter of bilingual education. I was not allowed to be on that commission. The governor wanted to appoint me, but I was considered too controversial. The report was no evidence that bilingual programs produce good or bad results. No evidence after 23 years. The most recent and comprehensive announcement on this issue was the National Research Council study published just last year, reviewing 30 years of bilingual education research. A very expensive study, and again, composed of 12 scholars, generally favorable to bilingual education, headed by Professor Kenji Hakuda of Stanford University, who has an excellent reputation in the field. Their major conclusion was this: we do not know whether there will be long-term advantages or disadvantages to initial literacy instruction in the primary language versus English. That is a devastating statement, and I'm afraid I will have to end. 1 minute. Oh, I didn't know that was the 1 minute bell. Let me say that the California Attorney General recently issued an opinion in which he stated the goal of bilingual education in California to be, quote, as effectively and efficiently as possible to develop in each child fluency in English, and further to provide equal opportunity for academic achievement. I believe this goal can be met if we remodel our bilingual programs, emphasize English language learning as early and as effectively as possible. There is time, and I believe in the goodness of knowing more than one language. I am fluent in 3. But that should come later. I believe if a community wants their Spanish or Chinese or Vietnamese-speaking children to be literate in the home language, first, the parents need to do the job at home, and secondly, it is not expensive to have after-school programs, Saturday programs, where the home language will be developed. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Finally, we have Patricia Gandara, who is Associate Professor of Education and Director of the Education Policy Center of the Linguistic Minority Research Institute at UC Davis. She directed education research for the California legislature and served as a commissioner for post-secondary education for the state of California. Her current research focuses on the effectiveness of particular educational interventions aimed at stimulating potential college students among low-income Latinos in California high schools. Professor Gandara.
Thank you. First, I would like to say that I in many ways agree with Ms. Porter with her comments. In particular, that bilingual education alone is not the solution to the problems of English language learners. Unfortunately, I think too many people, and Mr. Uns in particular, have tried to attach all the problems of undereducation to a particular issue, being bilingual education, and as Ms. Porter states, that really is not and cannot be seen as the case. I do want to address Mr. Uns's assertion that bilingual education has failed because insufficient numbers of English language learners are becoming fluent in English annually. But before I do that, I just parenthetically want to note what Mr. Uns did not tell you earlier was that he has never seen any of these programs which he is so ready to criticize. I'm troubled by that. Evidently, the evidence comes from newspaper and anecdotes, but I think there is a substantial amount of evidence out there that is of a little weightier value. One of the problems with his citing that only 5 or 6% of the children in California are redesignated, as we refer to it, as fluent English speakers every year, is that one, there has never been a program designed that purports to turn English language learners into fluent English speakers in 1 year. That's not something we know how to do. And in fact, in virtually every case where we have compared English-only programs to bilingual programs, we find that bilingual programs are redesignating children as fluent English speakers at much higher rates. For example, we looked at the data from a couple of districts in California that are very high-profile English-only districts. We looked at their redesignation figures for the years 1992 to 1996, were the last years for which we had those numbers. Between 2.6 and 3.6% of the students were redesignated as fluent English speakers every year. We then looked at a couple of districts that have been very high-profile bilingual districts, who've kind of gone to the mat on this and provide full-fledged bilingual programs. Their redesignation rates were between 9.5 and 12.4% a year. Other national studies have shown similar statistics, that bilingual programs have been doing a more efficient job of redesignating children as fluent English speakers than have English-only programs. There's a third point that I think needs to be made. Mr. Uns would like to tell you that the reason that limited English-speaking children, English language learners in California are having so much difficulty is because of the bilingual programs that they have been in. The problem with that is that 70% of the children in California who are English language learners have never been in a bilingual program. They've been in English-only programs. We do know some things from cognitive science and second language acquisition research that can guide policy. For instance, we know from cognitive science that learning occurs most efficiently when it builds on prior learning. This fact has clear implications for the education of English language learners. Let me suggest what a couple of them are. Generally speaking, children will learn to read most efficiently if they are taught to read in a language that already holds meaning for them. The key to both decoding and reading comprehension is in understanding the language that you are trying to do this in. Well, Mr. Uns contends that not much happens in the early grades, and therefore it's best to use this time teaching only English to children. Educators know better. All of the critical foundation for learning to read is being laid in these early years, and we know now that there is no time to lose in this process. Because if children are not reading at grade level by the 3rd grade, and I emphasize here in some language, any language, they are at serious risk of school failure. In fact, it's the best predictor we have of school failure in the early grades. We also know that once we allow the reading gap to open between English language learners and other students at the 3rd grade, we have never been successful in closing that gap. The gap between the two groups continues to grow, and by 12th grade, if the children stay in school that long, which is doubtful, that gap is 4 years. On the other hand, if children are reading at grade level in their native language, even though they are not reading in English, they are not at risk for school failure. In fact, those students who come to us at whatever age, reading at grade level in their native language, often excel in American schools and virtually always outperform students of their same ethnicity who are native born. We know that the most important thing that schools can do for English language learners is to teach them to read as soon as possible. And the most efficient way to do this will usually be through a language that they already understand. Delaying this activity until English is acquired places these children at serious risk of school failure. I'm going to summarize then by simply saying that placing these English language learners all together, as Mr. Uns would propose, in an ungraded classroom, that means children, he contends that the overwhelming majority of these children are 5 to 6 year olds. That's not the case. About 60% of the children who are English language learners are actually in the elementary grades. He would place all of these children together in ungraded classrooms with no specific curriculum and with teachers of unknown qualifications, because nothing is specified about this, for 1 year only. And after 1 year, they are mainstreamed with no support, simply for the purpose of learning English. This goes counter to everything we know about good education practice and jeopardizes the future of a whole generation of students. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panelists. We're going to open it up for Q&A now, and I'm going to try to alternate among the microphones, beginning with this one here, and then this one. And are there microphones upstairs somewhere? Where? Okay. But I'm going to ask the first question. And here it is. From a civil rights perspective, the courts as well as enforcement agencies have long viewed it as a violation of the civil rights statutes, the federal civil rights statutes, if a school district fails to provide an adequate access to education for students with limited English proficiency. That would seem to suggest that adopting curriculum strategies that do not have a reasonable basis in evidence for their likelihood of success in comparison with alternatives that are known amounts to a civil rights violation. Are you confident enough in your prescription of this curricular methodology to say that there would be no civil rights violations flowing from adoption of your proposal?
Yes, may I please?
Well, actually,
Why don't I? Let's let Mr. Uns and then.
You've actually raised a very important point. There's a common perception that bilingual education is in some way mandated or supported in federal law. That perception is entirely false. The key Supreme Court decision, which was Lau versus Nichols in 1974, simply said that schools have to do something to assist the education of children who don't know English. Guadalupe versus Tempe, which was a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision which covers California, specifically clarified Lau to say that bilingual education was in no way required. Extra help in learning English was absolutely acceptable under the Lau decision.
If it works.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the current, you've raised also a very good point in terms of what works and what doesn't work. If bilingual education actually worked, I would support it. But it doesn't work. The current system we have in California is so bizarre that even though bilingual education is mandatory for all 1.4 million limited English children, it physically can't be implemented. There aren't the teachers, there isn't the administration, there isn't the necessities to implement it. Therefore, only about a third of the children are actually in bilingual programs. And of those third, supporters of bilingual education themselves claim that 2/3 of those programs are absolutely no good. So only 10% of the students are in the legally mandatory bilingual education program that at least would be considered adequate by the supporters. On the other hand, a quarter of the children in California public schools are actually given no extra assistance whatsoever. They are in sink or swim, even though sink or swim is unconstitutional under Lau versus Nichols. So there are almost 3 times as many students taught under an unconstitutional method in California that are taught in supposedly well-designed bilingual programs. The system is an absolute and total mess and has to be changed and gotten rid of.
Ms. Porter, you want to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to add to that the perception I believe I received from your statement. Bilingual native language instruction programs may be the preferred method, but they are not the only acknowledged. The Castaneda decision gave a three-pronged test for what is an adequate program for bilingual children. One, it must use a theory that is recognized. English as a second language, English immersion, bilingual programs are all recognized. None of them are inferior to the other. And the second thing is that the school district must provide the resources to implement this. And the third, there must be proof within a year or 2 or 3 that it is improving the education of these children. So this is a very good legal basis.
Would either of you like to comment?
Yeah, now, I'm not an attorney, but if Mr. Uns says that sink or swim is against the law, from his initiative, Article 2, Section 305, it says, all children in California public schools shall be taught English by being taught in English. And then it goes on to say that they will be placed into one classroom and only be taught in one methodology. Now, if that's not sink or swim, I don't know what is.
I'm troubled by Mr. Uns's contention that the bilingual program is in trouble, and therefore what we should do is stop doing anything for these children. Just throw them into a classroom for 1 year with an unknown curriculum, with a teacher of unknown qualifications. In California, 1 out of 3 of the young people in the college-age population, 19 to 22, comes from a home in which another language is spoken. We have the resources to produce bilingual teachers in California. We simply have not had the commitment to do it.
Okay, now I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to try to ask that everybody keep your questions shorter than mine was. And would you please identify yourself?
Yes. My name is Carlos Romero. I am a student of the program here at the Kennedy School of Government, Master's in Public Policy. My question is for Mr. Uns. I'm a native Angelino, a product of the Los Angeles Unified School District. My sister is actually a bilingual teacher with a Master's in Education from Berkeley. My question for you is very specific. As someone with a scientific background, you must understand the necessity of having the very basic skills in math and in science to be able to compete in this rapidly technologically advancing world. How do you expect children to be able to compete in this world when in the formative years of their education, they are sitting in rooms where they have no clue and absolutely no idea of what is being taught in science and math, and not to mention history, civics, and all of the other very important subjects that they must master?
Thank you.
You've actually raised a very good point. I'm glad we're touching on that. I'd like to say that no, seriously, I mean, this is an important point. If we're talking about children who are 12 or 13 or 14 and come to the United States not knowing any English at that age and are starting school here, I think you can make a very good case in favor of bilingual education, keeping those children up in their academic subjects in their native language while they're learning English so they don't fall behind. But the overwhelming majority of the children we're talking about who are classified as limited English in California enter the public schools when they're 5 or 6 years old. Over half of them are native-born Americans. They start school with all the other children in their neighborhood. Bilingual education, in other words, not teaching the child English as soon as they start school, I think makes no sense for 5 or 6-year-old children. At young ages like that, all of the scientific research in neurobiology and the hard sciences shows that children can learn another language very quickly and easily in a matter of a few months if you're 5 or 6 years old. Therefore, under our initiative, the children would normally be placed in an English-oriented immersion program. They would be taught English, and then once they learned English, they would be moved in with all the other children. Furthermore, my co-proponent on the initiative, Gloria Mata-Tuckman, who's a first-grade teacher down in Santa Ana, is teaching a class where each year the children come in not knowing any English. They're usually Spanish-speaking or Vietnamese. And in that year, she teaches them all English, and at the end of that 1 year, they're reading and writing and speaking English just as well as any other first-grade child. What we're talking about is a complete misunderstanding of the current system. In other words, there is a perception out there. The symbolic poster child for bilingual education is a 14-year-old who comes into the schools not knowing any English. That is utterly false. We're talking about a tiny, tiny fraction of the school population. Finally, under our initiative, those parents who want bilingual education for their children can apply for a waiver to get it. And the older the child, the easier it is to get the waiver. Our initiative, I think, is the only approach to take with something like this, and it's also the approach used everywhere else in the world except the United States.
Mr.
Mr.
Honda?
Uns, what is the condition that has to be met for a parent to get a child out of the English-only class?
That's a very good answer. The answer to that are three possibilities. One, if the child already knows English, there are no restrictions on that child whatsoever.
Why
So-
would the child be in that classroom if they already know
Excuse me,
English?
can I finish? Can I finish? Okay. Children who already know English are subject to no restrictions whatsoever. Children who are over the age of 10 or older, simply have to get authorization from the local principal and support from the parent to place the child in something like a bilingual or other program. For children who are younger than 10, the parent has to request a waiver and then provide some indication that bilingual education or some other methodology would benefit their child's education in some way. The indications are virtually none of the parents in California like this current native language system for the children. The overwhelming majority want their children taught English as soon as they start school, and that will end the issue.
Mr. Honda, did you have a follow-up?
Well, in his initiative, it says that the existence of such special needs shall not compel the issuance of a waiver, and the parent shall be fully informed of their right to refuse to agree to a waiver. And that doesn't sound like it's any kind of a parent choice.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that, please. In fact, in order for the parent, what you need to know that he hasn't told you is that the parent cannot even initiate this until 30 days after the school has begun and the child has been in school. So we're into October sometime now. Then the parent may initiate it. Once the parent initiates that, then in order for a child who's under 10 to receive a waiver, it has to be demonstrated through some kind of testing that this child has special needs. We all know what that's code for. That's code for learning disabled, mentally retarded. There's something wrong with you. Therefore, we have to do something different for you because there's something wrong with you. Then, once this process has taken place, and which frequently takes 6 to 8 months in the schools right now to get somebody to come in and do a special testing, then the parent this waiver process then has to go to the principal and to the board. By the time all of this would have taken place, there would be no possibility for a child to be placed now into a classroom that does not exist. And if the parent is successful in this process, they have to start it all over again the next year.
Question?
Yes, my name is Kevin Shapiro. I'm also a product of the Los Angeles Unified School District, in fact, a graduate of North Hollywood High School, like Mr. Uns. And here at Harvard, I concentrate in cognitive neuroscience with a focus in linguistics. So the question I have is for Professor Gandara. You invoked cognitive science, which is something I happen to know something about, and you said that learning proceeds best when it builds upon other learning. Now, if we were talking about something like arithmetic, I would definitely agree with you. But there's a huge body of research in cognitive science that indicates that language learning is something separate, that in fact, up to about the age of puberty, language learning is rapid and automatic. And in fact, Mr. Uns is absolutely correct that it takes a very short amount of time for a small child to gain proficiency in a new language. So I just wondered, how you would respond to this in the face of, all the research that says that language learning is really a trivial problem for a small child.
I would respond to it in the following way, that when we talk about meaning, building on meaning, vocabulary is very important. For children, if children already have a vocabulary, it is an access point for them to learn to read. And in addition to that, I think there's a substantial amount of evidence that shows that, yes, children can learn a superficial level of any language rather rapidly, but the kind of language that is required in a classroom is of a qualitatively different sort that isn't learned on the playground or in superficial kind of contact, language contact. And that creates a new problem for children that is aided when that learning occurs in their own language.
May I?
I'd like to address this and the question that was asked earlier about how a student can learn math, science, social studies in a second language. Also, how can a child learn to read and write in a second language? The advances that have been made in the past 20 years in methodology of teaching school subjects and language at the same time, we call it in the field content-based language teaching. You use simple language at first, you're teaching an arithmetic problem or you're teaching a science experiment, and you are also teaching English at the same time. This is considered the most effective way to teach young children, and it doesn't take years. Within a few weeks, you can begin to be doing academic work in math. Within a few months, certainly in other subjects. So it can be done, it is being done.
Mr. Uns?
The point that raised was a very good one. I really appreciate the support from the hard sciences where the evidence is overwhelming that children can learn language very easily. Now the point, when I've debated this issue up and down in California, the other side always says, well, of course, if you're talking about a child learning kindergarten English or playground English, that's really quick and easy. But learning advanced academic English is much more difficult. That takes years. And that's true. But the children we're talking about are in kindergarten. If you take a child that doesn't know English and you teach him kindergarten English while he's in kindergarten, he's even with all the other children. The theorists behind the system of bilingual education actually publicly believe and say that it takes a young child 7 years to learn English, starting in kindergarten, and that's lunacy. The latest study that they've come out with claims that it takes a child 10 years to learn English. They are saying that if you start teaching a child English in kindergarten, around the time they get to high school, they'll finally learn English. And that is bizarre, utter lunacy.
Is there anybody at a microphone up there? Yes, okay.
Thanks, Leo. My name is Leo Correa. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. Just wanted to thank you again for coming, and also to underscore Ms. Gandara's point about the severity or the importance of this issue. LAUSD, I'm also an alum. 40% of the district's 640,000 children are limited English proficient, so this issue is extremely important. My question is for Mr. Uns. You're not just a scientist, but you're also a businessman. And as a businessman, I imagine that you can appreciate the value of consumer choice. And going back to what you said earlier, to what impelled you to pursue this initiative, and that was that you had observed schools refusing to teach courses in English. But as I understand it, under your initiative, schools would be refusing to teach courses in Spanish. So to go from one extreme to another, and given your value of consumer choice, how can you reconcile this contradiction?
First of all, there is no contradiction. Now, our initiative has been misportrayed by our opponents in really absurd ways. One reason I brought along a lot of copies of the initiative and informational materials is those of you who are actually interested in learning about the true facts of the initiative or reading the text can just come up here. There's a table out there with a lot of information on it. Our initiative does certainly not prohibit children being taught other languages. In fact, I come from Silicon Valley. Anybody who works in Silicon Valley or with the world of high technology or international trade knows that nowadays it's very useful for children to be taught other languages as well as English. In other words, if a child learns Chinese or Spanish or German, that's, a big plus. But the one essential language is English. The California public schools today, what is called bilingual education, is actually Spanish-only monolingual instruction. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it really is the reality. And that's the reason it has to change. Now, in terms of the parental impact and protest, I mean, what we have is a current system where parents have to carry picket signs to get their children taught English. And one thing driving it, which is a very important fact that all of you should realize, and coming from the business world and the world of incentives, I think is very clear to me, is that under the current system we have, schools are paid more money so long as children do not learn English. If a child learns English successfully in the public schools, the school loses money. That gives our public schools and school districts a tremendous incentive either in not teaching English or, in many cases, to pretending that children have not learned English, even if they have learned English. And that, I think, is the reason that they claim it takes 7 years for a child to learn English, which is utterly ridiculous.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
It's interesting that someone can draw anecdotes and then draw conclusions from that. But I was a principal of a grammar school, elementary school, that had bilingual Spanish, when the Vietnamese population came in, we established a Vietnamese bilingual program and also one for Cambodian. And you're sitting there telling me that the application of the practice didn't work. And yet, on a day-to-day basis, in the school that I worked in as a principal and as its educational leader, the youngsters were learning English, and not at the expense of losing their language, but utilizing the primary language as a tool for comprehension. Now we had a gentleman that talked about the brain development of brains. There is brand new research around neurophysiology that's telling us that youngsters are learning very quickly when they're exposed to languages, and they learn a lot, but they also can lose it quickly if it's not reinforced. Now let's get back to some intuitive kinds of things. If you're saying that we get youngsters who are limited English speakers who are going to be placed into classrooms where only English is going to be taught them, and then they're expected after 1 year, say they're kindergartners, after 1 year to speak as well as their counterpart, that doesn't make any sense to me, because you're asking these youngsters in one school year to be able to speak as proficiently as children who have been surrounded by English even before they're born for 9 months. After they're born, they got 5 years of exposure. So you want these youngsters to be able to speak proficiently, even if it's kindergarten, even if it's playground language, playground English, because I think Professor Gandara is making a distinction between English, that's social English, and English in the classroom, that's academic English. You want those youngsters to be able to speak as proficiently as those youngsters who've been speaking for 5 years, 9 months, and that doesn't make any sense. The point in your initiative, though, it says that these youngsters will be placed in a classroom for not exceeding 1 year. But you have to really think about what does 1 year mean in the academic world? It's 180 days, not 365 days. You want kindergarten youngsters to be able to have a proficiency in 180 days, being taught in a language they're not going to be able to comprehend, and be able to speak at the same level as youngsters who are 5 years and 9 months exposed to English. Intuitively, you just say that doesn't work.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think that's very well said, but I would like to point out, too, that Mr. Uns reveals his lack of familiarity with schools when he talks about kindergarten children being talked to in kindergarten language. The reason that any of us is here tonight is because people did not speak to us in kindergarten English when we were in kindergarten, but in fact, they gave us a rich vocabulary on which to build. And children are not successful in school on the basis of having received kindergarten dumbed down English made accessible through some kind of a sheltered program.
I think we're going to run out of time, so what I'd like to do is collect 3 or 4 questions from the audience, and then invite the panelists to respond to them, sort of take notes on the questions that are being asked, and then we'll give everybody a chance to respond. Was there another microphone up? Yes.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Maya Fetterman, and apparently, like everyone else, I'm a California native. My question is actually somewhat similar to the last question, but I think there's still some confusion as to what is allowed by the initiative, both among proponents and opponents of bilingual education. A month and a half ago, the city of Santa Barbara voted to eliminate its bilingual education program and replace it with an English emphasis, English language learners program. The superintendent was quoted as saying, however, that the UNS initiative would wipe out this new program. I've always therefore been wondering about how you've decided to write the initiative in light of the fact that many local districts have applied for waivers to start a variety of new programs. I'm wondering why your initiative was written to mandate a specific type of program instead of written to eliminate California's mandate for bilingual education.
Okay, down here. Question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering in
I'm
regards...
sorry, could you identify yourself?
My name is Javier Kinney, and I'm a student at Tufts University.
You're from Los Angeles, aren't you?
I'm from Northern California.
Amazing.
But I'm wondering from the panel, maybe particularly Mr. Uns' reaction or reflection of what types of implications or effects this type of initiative will have on the over 110 Native American tribes and numerous federally recognized tribes in California that are currently sustaining, preserving, and restoring their tribal languages, and what visions I guess the panel has on the educational visions of these Native American students.
Interesting. And question here.
I'm Nicole Rodriguez, and I'm actually not from California. I'm from Boston. And I would like to address, in your opening speech, Mr. Uns, you said that at 6th grade, a person who has been in bilingual ed from kindergarten through 3rd grade will have both an education level of, an English speaking level and an education level of a 6th grader. I was actually in bilingual ed from kindergarten through 3rd grade, and then was immersed in 4th grade. And I'm actually here at Harvard and an English major. But anyway, besides that minor point, I'd like to know, in your plan, in your proposal, is the main point really to get the kids to learn English or to learn in general?
Okay, and let's take one more question up there.
My name is Vicki Nunez, and I'm not a student here at Harvard. I actually work for the Department of Ed here in the state of Massachusetts. And I guess I want to reflect back on the opening context that was created around this in terms of the kinds of public policy that's coming out of California, and whether that leads towards an ability for people in this country to live in peace and harmony with new immigrants, or whether it's creating an environment of antagonism. And I'm particularly concerned putting this into the context of previous English-only legislation. I'm questioning what's all the concern around people learning English in the largest English-speaking country in the world, where 97% of the population speaks English. So I just really want to question and look critically at whether these types of public policy initiatives lead people who live in the United States to be able to live in harmony, or whether it leads to greater conflict and antagonism and violence.
Okay. If everybody is very crisp. Since a lot were directed over here to Mr. Uns, if we just very crisply and go across.
Okay, going through a few of the points. First of all, I'd like to say that there's a misperception on the part of some Anglos that Latino immigrants and immigrants in general don't want to learn English, or they don't want their children to learn English. That is utterly false. The single greatest desire of most immigrant families in the United States and California is to make sure that they can improve their English skills and that their children can learn English. And that's why they're extraordinarily unhappy with the current system of Spanish-only instruction in the schools, which is why the polls seem to show that we have overwhelming support among Latinos in California. They want their children to be taught English. They're very unhappy that the schools, because of ridiculous educational theories, deny their children the right to learn English. And I think this initiative will be a very unifying initiative, because it will get the votes of basically almost all the different groups in the state of California. On some of the other points, with regard to Santa Barbara and some of the other school districts, it is true that a total of 4 school districts in the state of California, by spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of effort through the legal process, have been able to secure waivers from the current mandatory bilingual education system. But that's 4 out of over 1,000 school districts. 99.5% of all the students in California are in districts where bilingual education is mandatory, and it just doesn't work. That's the problem with it. I think our initiative will certainly set into motion trends which will probably get rid of bilingual education across the rest of the country as well, for one simple reason. The only problem with bilingual education is that it just doesn't work and never has worked.
The Native American
sorry, with that, to be honest, I don't know the exact educational details of some of the Native American tribes in the state, but it's true the initiative would, I don't know if they're part of school districts or not, or whether they're even covered by state educational law or not. But it would require, if the tribes are not teaching English to their children, it would require the parents of the children in those tribes to request waivers, presumably from the tribal leaders, to prevent their children from being taught English. But I think probably most people in the tribes would want their children taught English as well.
Okay.
One of the questions that interested me was, is the goal to learn English or to learn in general? There is no division. No one in American education is going to say that the only thing our children need is to learn the English language. They need to learn the English language for academic use, for equity, but it is not a matter of simply teaching language, it is a matter of teaching language for school purposes. The policy, I do not believe the policy will be divisive, because I too have been in touch with Latino groups. I have been called to be an expert witness on behalf of the Bushwick Parents Organization of 150 families in Brooklyn that sued the state of New York because their children were not being taught English in 3 years, in 6 years, in 7 years. A major suit. Las Familias del Pueblo in Los Angeles. And then I'm a pragmatist. It comes down to dropout rates, which are horrendous for Latino students. 37% as of the latest government report. This is unconscionable. When African American dropout rates have fallen to 15% and are approaching the 10% for white non-Hispanics. Latino dropout rates are still high in spite of bilingual education. We need to do something better.
I would simply like to repeat that since the majority, the overwhelming majority of these children, these Latino children, have never received a bilingual education, that it is absolutely absurd to blame the dropout rate on bilingual education.
Not true. Not true.
I would also like to emphasize that bilingual education programs do teach English. And in fact, every study that has ever been done looking inside classrooms, and I repeat, inside classrooms rather than at newspapers, has shown that the overwhelming majority of the time is spent, in fact, in English, even in programs that purport to be heavily native language. And third, I think it's important to clarify what the public really thinks about this. In this poll that you heard about, that was conducted just a couple weeks ago by L'Opinion in Los Angeles, 88% of the parents who had children in bilingual education programs said they were happy with their programs. They liked those programs. Unfortunately, about 50% of them also said that they would vote for the Uns initiative because it was English for the children. There is tremendous confusion out there in the public. This initiative was given that name for a purpose, to create that kind of confusion in people's minds, because of course every immigrant parent wants English for his or her child.
Just a closing remark. The way the issue around bilingual education is framed, it sounds like this is a recent issue for the last 30 years. At the turn of the century on the East Coast, bilingual education was an issue among the Jews, among the Irish, and among the Italians, just clearly. And then in the state of California, the whole issue around language learning is a very important issue, because it's not only a Latino issue. It's not only a Latino issue. We have to get this really straight. It's an issue that affects Asians who come from different language backgrounds, and other immigrants such as Ethiopians and Russian Jews. They all need language assistance for their children to be able to comprehend what's going on in the classroom. That's what bilingual is all about. It's about learning English without losing content, materials, and losing time in the classroom. If you really think about it, if youngsters are kept in a classroom for 1 year being taught English in English, those children will lose 1 whole year of instructional time, and that's a big waste of public taxes.
I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions. Dan, you had a question, and one over here, Irma. I'm under instructions to end promptly at 9:30. So.
May I ask a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're next.
Thank you. My name is Roger Rice. I'm from Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm trying to figure out how your proposal would work, Mr. Uns. If an English-speaking Anglo parent in California wants to have his or her child enrolled in a, say, French immersion school, do they have to go through this waiver business that Mr. Hahn is talking about?
Sorry?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Oh,
Quick
right.
answer. Yeah.
If you're talking about a child who would be, if you're talking about a child who would be placed in an all non-English oriented program, they would have to go through the waiver process.
They would. Okay, and Mr. Edley asked a civil rights question earlier. The Supreme Court in Laos said sink or swim is illegal. Your proposal says keep them on the life raft maybe for 1 year and then push them over. I suggest that's equally illegal.
Dan, you have a quick question?
Okay. I have a question for Ms. Porter and Professor Gandara. I can talk to Ron and Mike anytime. And this has to do with a point that was made earlier. One of the advantages of the initiative process in California for both ballot initiatives that pass and fail is that it allows a public debate on issues that otherwise would not take place. I mentioned at the outset tonight that legislation in the California legislature has died in committee for 10 or 11 consecutive years on this subject. There was a bill that was killed last year that is up again this year that I'd like to describe to you briefly. It's a bill sponsored by State Senator D.D. Alpert and State Assemblyman Brooks Firestone. And that would, rather than adding a mandate of the type that Ron's initiative is talking about, it would simply allow each school district on an individual basis to decide whether to continue the current program of bilingual education or, as Ron's initiative suggests, would remove it. And given your public policy backgrounds, I'd be interested in your reactions to that potential compromise.
Okay, and last question, Irma.
Hi, my name is Irma Munoz, and I'm an immigrant from Mexico. I came to this country when I was 17 and a half years old, and I was forced to either sink or swim. Obviously, I swam. However, I did it at great costs. I think it was an incredibly traumatic experience, and part of what I'm hearing today has gone to address the academics of children learning English, but you haven't addressed the issue of the psychological implications of having children being placed in environments where they can't understand a thing anyone is saying.
If, let me start on this end and ask our panelists to respond to those as they will, and also wrap up. And so briefly.
Local choice.
I believe there was a question regarding SB 6 as a compromise bill in terms of a replacement or an alternative to the Proposition 227. To me, there are no choices. There are two separate distinct issues. One is a statute that deals with bilingual education, and the other is an initiative that would be law and outlaw SB 6 if passed.
Mr. Schnur raises the issue that for 11 years this has dragged on and that we have not been able to come to some kind of a consensus. I don't have any particular problem with SB 6. I think the problem that's been out there is that for a long time now we have known how to do this right. And yet the political will has not been there to do it. And I think this is the frustration that people have felt with voting for a bill that is, a little patch here, a little patch there, but not really doing what we know how to do well.
I have followed the workings of the California legislature very closely and reviewed the bills that have been introduced at least every year for the past 5 years and have gone into oblivion. I think many of the conditions in those bills, I believe, were very favorable. Local choice. I have been advocating this in Massachusetts for years, where we have a very strict bilingual education law that allows only native language instruction programs. I would have liked to see the D.D. Alpert bill or some of the others come through. So 11 years go by. In the absence of legislation, the California Department of Education keeps the mandate for native language instruction. As Ron said, only 4 districts out of 1,000 have received waivers to do an English language program. Instead, it should be a local choice.
Can you comment on the psychological cost issue?
I, like you, came to America when I was 6 years old. sat in a classroom in Newark, New Jersey. Nobody knew my language and nobody helped me at all. It was sink or swim. I swam. That's not the ideal way. But we are not talking about sink or swim. We are talking about helping children learn the language quickly. We know very good ways. The El Paso study, which compared English immersion students with transitional bilingual students in the same school district, the same Latino children, no difference in self-esteem, no difference in stress level, which are the things that bilingual advocates say happen to kids if they are put into English language too early. There are good ways of doing it.
With regard to that point, somebody who comes to the United States not knowing any English and starts school at the age of 17, regardless of what method you use, will certainly be under a lot of strain in the public education system, whether you use immersion, whether you use bilingual, whether you use anything. But the overwhelming majority, almost all the children we're talking about, are 5 or 6 years old. And at that age, teaching them English is a very, very easy thing to do with almost no psychological cost whatsoever.
Could you comment, and I'm sorry, could you comment on the alternative that Dan Schnorr
Oh, yes,
was talking
exactly. I'd like to say it's interesting because
local control as opposed to private.
there's been a bill proposed now 4 years in a row in the state legislature, the Alpert Firestone bill, which would allow local school districts to decide what sort of program they would have. The bill was defeated 4 years in a row by the supporters of bilingual education. I think the bill was a very bad bill for other reasons, and now it's essentially a moot point since people are going to be voting on our initiative in about 3 months.
Let me take one liberty, a brief announcement that upstairs in the penthouse, immediately following this event, there is a reception. I should emphasize it is a fundraising reception for the Harvard Journal of Hispanic Policy. So all of you are encouraged to go upstairs and take your wallets with you. It'll be a great party. And in conclusion, let me just take the liberty of expressing 2 concerns about the way this seems to be unfolding. One is that it is very interesting to me that the issues of race and color have not yet been explicit in the discussion of bilingual education and in the debate in California. And I fear, frankly, that some of the attitudes on the underlying policy issue, and I'm not speaking here in an ad hominem way, but I'm just saying that I would expect that there is some fraction of people out there whose view about bilingualism, whose view about this educational policy issue is infected with, let's say, nativist, xenophobic, perhaps racist, perhaps discriminatory attitudes. And what will be interesting to explore is whether the tone of the debate that we've seen tonight that tries to stay above that can be maintained through the debate on this proposition in the months ahead. The second thing that I wanted to raise, however, is the question of the role of evidence and research. I have reviewed some of the research studies. As part of the Civil Rights Project here, we've had some conferences discussing bilingual education and issues affecting civil rights of Latinos. And the research is confused. I was just reading before this discussion tonight a meta-analysis of over 75 studies on bilingual education. The Kenji Hakuda study that was mentioned earlier is a very important and impressive document. The research evidence is mixed. It is very difficult to interpret. But what concerns me, I think, about the way that this debate is unfolding is that the fundamental touchstone of what will be best for the children in creating opportunity and trying to wrestle with the question of what is known as an answer to that often gets lost in hurling charges back and forth, of hurling anecdotes back and forth, of appealing to personal experiences as opposed to what can be gleaned from systematic research. I've had experience as a political hack, so I know that research does not usually drive policy debates. But here is one that is so fraught with implications for our social cohesion as well as for the opportunity in America that I sincerely hope that the discussions ongoing in California and throughout the nation can be as thoughtful as the one we've had tonight, and perhaps even better. Please join me in thanking our panelists and thanking the Institute and the students at the Kennedy School for doing this. Are we done? Is that it?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
I see you again. Please drop.
Still on? Yeah.
Carmen, I'll be right back.